All right. So I wanted to cover Divided Republic, in part because, well, I need a break from EU, but also this is a game that when I first covered 1960, it was brought to my attention. Hey, this thing, should be showing up. It looks really interesting, and it looks like what you're talking about. And great minds think alike, or whatever. Alex Bogossi came up with pretty much the idea that I came up with on my playing of it in 1960 was, why don't we do other political campaigns in the same kind of detail as 1960 does. And this game tries to do that with the most obviously interesting campaign in U.S. history, that of the 1860 presidential campaign. Lincoln and Douglas, we all remember, but we may not remember some of the other characters who actually probably polled better than Douglas did in terms of electoral votes. Breckinridge, the current vice president, and John Bell, who didn't do too great, but tried to form some sort of compromise party as a final way for the attempt to save the Union. So you've got a very divided United States, and a geographically divided one. Not so much like today where, you know, yes, there's a geographical divide, but there's sparse little areas where, more industry or whatever, or more older cities exist is really the focus of, where the Democrats are congregated, as opposed to the broad expanses of land with few people where the Republicans tend to be concentrated. Well, here instead, though, you have one where the ideological divide is very geographically based in a different sort of sense. The livelihood of the areas is dependent upon the key issue of the day, which is, of course, slavery. So, how do you represent that in the game, and what does this one do? I'm going to go briefly over the rules, but someone did a rules primer, which I would suspect is much, much better than whatever I would do. Okay, but I do need to do it just to kind of get my grasp on the rules again. I played it once at Concept World Expo. I'm not sure what his position is, but he's certainly related to Numbskull Games. He may kind of own Numbskull Games, more or less. He was not the designer of this game, but I believe he's designed some other games. Patrick Stevens, I think. I'm not sure. He's active on the Geek. Was present and very kind to demonstrate the game to us, and it was great to have somebody who had some significant knowledge of the game showing it. Okay, so this is going to be basically a CDG like 1960 is, and you're going to be competing for, again, the electoral votes. It's got some different mechanisms, though, and it's four-player, which is kind of an interesting situation. Well, and it also means that you don't have to worry quite so much about balance issues, because the players will take care of the balancing themselves, which may be a historical issue in its own way. We'll see. Okay, so you're going to be playing through 6 turns. Now, the first 5 are handled largely in the same way. The 6th one has a special polling situation and a few special rules to handle it. Let's see what we've got here. So, play is going to be determined by momentum order. And that's set at the beginning of the game, and then will change due to something called regional polling. Basically, as you gain control of states, whoever owns the most states, in the current apparent, if you were to hold an immediate election today, it looks like it would fall that way. Well, that person will rate first in momentum, and other people rate behind them. Apparently you do dice-offs for momentum behind that. I'm not sure how much advantage there is to going first in and of itself, but there's an advantage to being in the first momentum slot, because on every turn after the first, you get an extra card for doing so. Moving first or moving second, or moving later in the turn, I think that's somewhat dependent on the situation. each of the, just to be completely random here, each of the powers or parties, players, has a list of special rules applying to themselves, along with some of the basic rules of the game included on here, and a nice background information on each of the different parties and on the candidates involved. Okay, so where were we? Yes. So player order is going to be determined by the momentum counters. And on each turn, well, each player is going to get 5 actions. And they take these in order based on the momentum situation. Where, like in any other CDG, they're going to play a card. And it's going to have either a value. And this is like 1960 in that you get to throw some little cubes down based on the points that you spend. So this would give you essentially 3 votes, basically. However, there's some expenses to that. Alternatively, there's always an event on here that you could play instead. And some of those events have some fairly special rules, like stump speeches and stuff. Okay. Now, after each player's taken their action, you go around, you do the next action. Once you go through all of them, well, you move the turn marker forward. You determine what the momentum is for that next turn, i.e. who has the most electoral votes captured already. It gets the momentum. You deal out a new hand of cards. Now, players are allowed to discard their cards in this one. All right. Let's take a look at what playing a card for its value is like. Just a little bit into there. So this one gives me 3 pips. I'm allowed to play these in states, okay? But if I play it in a specific state, then I can only play in that region unless I'm willing to pay an extra piece to place a piece into a region. So for example, if I placed a piece in North Carolina, it would then cost me 2 to place a piece in Florida. Likewise, if I'm placing a piece in the state that another player already controls, and already controls is an indication of whether they've exceeded this number already. So for example, here we've already got at least 3, equal to or exceeded, say. Well, in order for me to play even a single pip in here, I've got to spend an extra 1, and then I can't spend my third piece there, so I'd have to throw it somewhere where it's safe. If you end up tying the amount there, they no longer control the state, so then you can play at normal price. If you end up playing out of the initial region that you played in and in a state somebody else controls, you have to pay 2 extra pips to go in there. So you kind of have to calculate and figure out what you want to do before you start slapping your pieces down, at least if you're going to go outside of your general region. In general, you don't want to do that. At least one of the players, though, Breckenridge, has as his special ability, I do believe, we can find it, he doesn't have to pay an extra point when he campaigns outside the first region that he played in. Like I said, each of the powers has their own special abilities and their own little special rules. They're not too burdensome, but they do add a little bit of flavor and excess to it. So for example, the Republicans have actually some penalties against them. These starred states, they can't place in because they're not on the ballot there. They're allowed to place in South Carolina, but that's kind of dangerous, and it can cause an early secession if they win. So they also lack something called a personal appearance, which I'll get to in a moment, and they get an extra free card every turn, so they get more options. Each of the players has one of these. So, for example, let's see, John Bell has he wins ties in the Mid-Atlantic, Pacific West, or Upper South. If anyone ties, it doesn't even have to be him, and he's got a political control marker in there at all, one of those markers, he wins the state. That's kind of a neat little ability where maybe he wants to target other people to try to balance things. And then finally, the Northern Democrats have a weird ability which allows them, when they do a platform speech, that they can actually penalize other people with a little bit better targeting accuracy. I've got some questions on whether that's terribly useful. In fact, the whole idea of targeting someone with the platform speeches seems a little iffy. But maybe we'll see reasons to do it, at least when you have that targeting ability. When you don't have that, it seems really questionable, unless there's political concerns between the players, like, hey, let's do this instead of growing our own. But I think that would be hard to do. Okay. So platform speeches are a kind of campaign event, and what they're going to allow you to do is basically roll a die, and you get a certain number of pieces to play in a region. And the die roll is modified by really the event that's being triggered there. So in some cases, a subject may be something that's of more interest to one region than another, so you can get a higher die roll there. It's just a different option of a way to get points to place, but those points are just placed. They're not normal campaigning, which means you don't have to pay extra to drop pieces in, so they can give you advantages that you can't get by normal placement. Now, they can also be used to withdraw pieces from someone else, and that's what I kind of don't think is terribly valuable, because it's a 4-player game. Pulling other people's pieces out isn't usually going to really help you terribly much. But maybe we'll see situations of that, because of course I'm doing my playthrough for this. Alright. Polling cards. Polling cards are also an event. They have a point or an option to play them as a polling card. Now the polling card says, hey, this region is being polled. What happens is you go through state by state, and if somebody has the lead in a state, and they've equaled or exceeded the, I don't know, whatever limitation you have to pass, I don't remember what it's actually called, but it's sort of the control limit or something like that. And once you pass that, and if you have the highest number in there, well, you've won that state, sort of. And you get a card for that state, indicating the electoral points for it, and that'll affect your momentum. It doesn't really affect anything else. But if you win a state, and you have at least twice as many as were needed, then you get a lock marker. And those are over here. And that means you will not lose that state. And that's a powerful, powerful thing. So that's the reason you want to do regional polls, really, is to lock states. Doing it without locking states, you're probably wasting an action in that case. Let's see. There's some cards that can be played in reaction to other cards. So, for example, if somebody raises a scandal about you, you can kind of turn it against them. Stuff like that. That's kind of fun. There's some a little bit of opportunity for role-playing in there, where you can make up the scandal or whatever. And it can be lighthearted in that sense. Okay, so the key to the game is to, well, is winning the states, obviously. But so we have to go over the voting for that, but we also have to worry about, there's 2 ways to win. Basically, it's unlikely you're going to win by taking a majority of the Electoral College when there's 4 major candidates running and a couple of minor ones to boot. So, for example, New York could end up as a neutral state, as could Texas, just by, winning out over the more general parties. Okay, so there's a few special cases on states here. First of all, for the most part, if you win a tie in a regional poll, nothing happens. Nobody gets the votes. But in the final polling of the game, after turn 6, it's imperative that everything be decided. So if there's a tie, in general, the person who has the most other states in that region will win that state. However, there's an exception to that, which is strongholds. That's these little, I guess they're supposed to be birds or something. Each group has, or each party has a stronghold. may indicate a home state advantage or a state where they had a particular political advantage. In the case that either Kansas or Nevada comes into the play, they could become your home state, your stronghold as well. Strongholds give you a number of advantages here, and I left out what one of them is. It's kind of buried in the rules somewhere else. I'll leave that alone. Okay, so a stronghold wins ties in the stronghold state in regional and final polling. And if it wins all final polling rounds, in which it achieved the minimum PCR for control of the stronghold state, even if other parties have gotten more points total. So it's kind of an interesting situation. Green is going to win this as long as they keep 4 pieces here. Another reason you might want to target to remove pieces from them. With the one exception being that an opponent could lock the state by having twice the number needed. Okay. Just to clarify that just a little bit more, let's say red has 5 more pieces in here. They have 8 pieces at the end of the game. Well, blue, with 4, is not going to win. If blue gets a 5th piece, they would win it even though red has more. But that's only at the end of the game? Yeah. Not during the normal polling. And we weren't really sure of this when we scored our game because, unfortunately, the guy who was running the game for us had to go to the seller's room to find out before we could find out who won. But I'm not sure that would have affected things. All right. New Jersey has special rules in case of a tie. If New Jersey ends up in a tie in the final polling round, the parties distribute the electoral votes evenly, and then any remainder goes to whoever's left with the most votes, with an exception, I think, that the Southern Democrats can't win, but I'm not sure. Yeah, the Southern Democrats cannot gain that remainder points. So it's possible that New Jersey's electoral votes will be split up. It's kind of a little off the board because what really would have happened in New Jersey is that, let's say there were 2 political cubes there for one color and one from another. Well, no. It's an odd situation. It only happens on a tie, which means they split the electoral votes evenly, whereas it would have been possible for the electoral votes not to be split evenly. There's 7 votes. It would be possible for, say, 5 to go to one player and 2 to another or something like that, by the way New Jersey's political system was set up. This is just an attempt to be a little less cumbersome in terms of the rules, I guess, making it a lesser thing. New York and South Carolina have a couple special rules here. Well, New York and Texas, I'm sorry. South Carolina's got a different special rule. New York and Texas have rules where if you tie on the final round, nobody wins. The state goes to a third-party candidate. In the case of South Carolina, South Carolina was one of the last states holding on to a pure state legislature deciding who wins the elections. So they have some special rules. Only the Southern Democrats can win South Carolina by reaching the PCR rating of 3 during the regional or final polling. The Constitutional Unionists and Northern Democrats can get it with a rating of 6. South Carolina can never be locked, a special rule applying to them. The Republicans are able to win South Carolina, but they must have at least 6 PCFs and 2/3 of the total there. And if they win in that final round, you roll a die, and on a 5 or a 6, South Carolina secedes from the game, and everyone loses. The other way that you could have a secession rule is Kansas and Nevada. If they both come into play as free states, there's a chance of secession there. I have to... Yeah, it's based on how well the Republicans are doing, and that can be kind of painful. Now, Nevada will always be a free state. Kansas need not be. If one of the two more southern parties plays, the Kansas enters receives statehood card, then it enters as a slave state, and it's okay to bring Nevada in. In either case, if you play the card to bring a state in, you get a stronghold marker there, and you've got some advantages towards capturing that state for the final election. One rule I didn't go over is something called personal appearance. It's got a number of special abilities. Everyone except the Republicans has one for free, but only one for the whole game. There's a card that can give you an additional one, which I guess anyone can play. It can be used in a number of ways. One way is to double the value of a card used for a campaign action. That's a powerful ability. Turn this from a 3 to a 6, great. But you only get one of those. Let's see what else we got. It can also be used to re-roll a card effect or event requiring a roll of a die. All right, again, that might be really useful, but you might roll the same again. The most powerful that I've seen is to cancel an action undertaken by an opponent. This includes playing asterisk events, which, some of the event cards have an asterisk on them, which means they can only be played once, and then they're as an event, and then they're removed from the game. Anyway, if you play your personal event to cancel that, it still gets rid of the asterisk card, which is kind of powerful. I find that the more useful of them, to just cancel somebody's action entirely. They might have something powerful that they're about to do. But the other uses are not totally worthless, and you should be able to get one out by the end of your game. To win the game, you need 152 of 303 electoral votes. Okay. Well, there's 4 players. How do you do that? Yeah, that's the problem. So it's unlikely, although in the game that I played, it happened, that somebody's going to reach the electoral victory. If they don't, then what happens? It gets thrown to the House of Representatives, of course. Each state gets a single vote. Okay. So, among the top 3 electoral college vote getters, if no one party among the top 3 in momentum achieves the number of electoral votes for an outright win, then the presidency is awarded to the party controlling the most states. Okay? So you just count the cards. And if that doesn't work, well, you've got such an electoral crisis that everything falls apart and goes to hell and everybody loses. And that's one of 3 ways that everyone can lose. There's rules for a 2 or 3 player game. We started out playing the 3-player game. It seemed to work pretty well. The 4-player game also seemed to work pretty well. I'm not quite sure about balance, but again, balance issues can be tweaked around because you've got an alliance in play. I haven't tried the 2-player game yet. I'll probably end up trying it at some point. All right, well, we'll see if I can get this done in 4 or 5 hours or so as a nice break for me, you.